Okay, so it sounds better to you than it does to me? It does not, okay. As long as we're together on that, I appreciate it. I have two microphones, I guess like my moderator microphone and then my Obert microphone. I'm not really sure which one you want me to use. We'll figure it out. Is this better? I mean, I have a loud voice. Do I need the mic?
No.
Thank you. Okay. One more time. Good morning, welcome to the conference. My name is LaShawn Williams. I'll be moderating our first panel for today, which consists of myself, Dr. Ryan Gabriel, Dr. William Smith, and Tekulve Jackson Vann are my colleagues here on the panel to discuss with you some historical and present day issues as they concern Black people, and then specifically applied to Black members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in order from where they sit next to me, and we will get started with the format after our introductions. Dr. Ryan Gabriel received his BA in sociology from Utah State University and earned his PhD from the University of Washington in 2016. He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Brigham Young University, where he teaches courses on race in the U.S. and social statistics. Ryan's research focuses on the processes of racial residential stratification. In particular, he examines the roles of racial differences in the adolescent neighborhood context on adult processes of residential mobility and on the perpetuation of racial stratification. Additionally, he investigates the residential mobility and neighborhood attainment of mixed-race couples. Ryan also examines the association between spatial concentrations of housing foreclosures and racial differences in neighborhood attainment. Lastly, he has conducted research on lynching in the American South. Welcome, Dr. Gabriel.
Thank you.
Dr. William A. Smith received his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in Educational Policy Studies, Sociology, Social Psychology of Higher Education specifically. Currently, he is professor and chair of the Department of Education, Culture, and Society at the University of Utah. He also holds a joint appointment in the Ethnic Studies Program, African American Studies Division. Dr. Smith is the co-editor with Philip Outback and Kofi Lamoti of The Racial Crisis in American Higher Education, The Continuing Challenges for the 21st Century, 2002. In 2018, he received the College of Education's Faculty Service Award for Outstanding Research and Scholarship. Dr. Smith's work has appeared in such prestigious journals as the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, Journal of Negro Education, Harvard Educational Review, Educational Administration Quarterly, American Educational Research Journal, and American Behavioral Scientist, among others. Welcome, Dr. Smith. Tekulve Jackson Vann is a native of Milledgeville, Georgia. He earned a BS in Marriage, Family, and Human Development with an emphasis in Family Life Education from Brigham Young University and an MS in Marriage and Family Therapy from Valdosta State University. He is currently a PhD student in Medical Family Therapy at North Central University. Tekulve is the co-author of Broken Homes, Solid Futures, a marriage education program for adult children of divorce. He is the past vice president of the Southeastern Council on Family Relations. He is a clinical fellow of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, an AAMFT supervision candidate, and licensed marriage and family therapist. Currently, he's the clinical director of Alpine Recovery Lodge and managing clinician of J. Tekulve Jackson Vann, LMFT, and Associates. He also serves as the Young Men's president of the LDS Genesis Group, the Genesis music director, sings in the Deborah Bonner Unity Gospel Choir, and is a past BYU Black Student Union president. Welcome to Tekulve. And I'm LaShawn. Okay, the format of our panel is as follows. We will first hear from Dr. Gabriel, and then we will hear from Dr. Smith. Followed by that, Tekulve will give a 10-minute response, and I will wrap up our panel with another 10-minute response. And at that point, we'll open it for question and answer from the audience. Someone will be the runner of the microphone because in these hills, that is not possible. We welcome you to, if you would like to go live on the Facebook page, to share this with others who are not able to attend. I encourage you to do so, and if that gets me in trouble, I'm only here for today, and they can find me if they have a problem with that. So, start recording after my comment now. Okay, all right. So, we'll get started first with Dr. Gabriel, and then we'll proceed to that point and transition with Dr. Smith. Dr. Gabriel, thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you, LaShawn. It's great to be here with you today, to see some of my colleagues in the crowd, former students, and hopefully new friends. I've been asked to speak on the history of racial violence within the United States. So, to start out with, I really believe legacies matter. We have these two important revolutions. We have the American Revolution, the French Revolution. These two in the 1700s reshaped the world, and we are still feeling the effects of these events today. These revolutions changed political systems across the entire world, undermined absolute monarchies, changed relationships between countries, shifted migration patterns among large populations. The after effects of these revolutions are seemingly innumerable. Sorry, people. The Civil Rights Movement had a major effect on our lives today. Through the commitment of normal people, like you and me, to the commitment of the cause of freedom, our country instituted new laws in the 1960s to help create a more just and equitable society. However, we tend to overlook the legacy of racial violence within the United States, particularly that violence towards African Americans. Why do we do this? Well, there's probably many reasons, but one of the largest ones that I can think of is that this is an ugly, unflattering history that goes against the core values of our democracy, that all men, and I say women, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if we avoid discussing our history of racial violence, the reasons we provide for contemporary racial violence become twisted, they become distorted. So given this, my intention with this discussion is to provide a brief overview of the history of racial violence towards blacks in the United States. So I'm breaking up U.S. history into broadly three sections. We have slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. Also civil rights and after. One thing to keep in mind as I go through these particular histories is to recognize that 7/8 of our history as a country, blacks have faced overt legal discrimination. That's a long time. That's a really, really long time. So I believe these residual effects are still alive and present today. So the first section I'm going to speak on is slavery. I can only touch on these briefly. People have dedicated their entire lives to these subjects, so this is a 50,000-foot view. So what we see here is a slave ship. One of the things I'd like you to recognize in this depiction of a slave ship is kind of the cool, cold, efficient calculation with which they place bodies within this ship. If you look on the right, you can see how they say that these black bodies should be stacked in order to maximize the amount of cargo, the amount of people that can make it across. Roughly, estimates are 10 to 15 million Africans were transported to the Americas. But we know of, say we take 100 people captured in Africa, 64 would arrive at the coast alive, 57 would live through coastal imprisonment to be packed onto ships, 48 would survive the journey to be placed on the auction block, and then only 28 of the original 100 would survive the first few years of slave labor. Here we have an incredibly disturbing picture of a lattice work of scars on the back of a black slave. You can tell he's been struck many times, healed, and then restruck. For slaves, They were denied citizenship, as you well know, but even the most minute areas of their life were governed, their most intimate spheres. Slaves were not allowed to own or carry arms, obviously, trade goods, possess land, leave their master's property without permission, socialize with free blacks, have a marriage be officially recognized, cannot testify in court, read or write, or keep their names. Sometimes names were given like monkey or villain. And you see when African Americans become free and they take on new names, names of Washington, names of King, names that force whites to recognize their humanity. Next, moving on to Reconstruction and Jim Crow. With Jim Crow, I think this is a history that in popular imagination is often overlooked. I think it's much easier to visualize and understand what life would be like as a slave. However, one of the things I'll work to discuss and show to you is how slavery continued through Jim Crow statutes. And I call it a specter of Jim Crow because it was almost like a ghost, an ever-present entity that was throughout every interpersonal interaction and embedded every institution of life, both blacks and whites alike. So these statutes kept blacks in an inferior position to whites. I'm going to list a few. We have sharecropping. Basically, black families would lease land from a landowner. They would also lease the resources to cultivate that land. Then at the end of the year, they would try to square their books with the landowner. There's no better business bureau at this point of time. African Americans, many can't read and write, signing contracts with an X. So there's no incentive for these landowners to treat them fairly. So often these individuals come up short and placed in a position of debt. We call this debt peonage, where African Americans are basically tied to the land and the landowner in perpetuity. We have separate but equal statutes. This is often kind of the elementary idea that we get. We see those pictures of separate water fountains and bathrooms. Black disenfranchisement. This happened through African Americans having to pay poll taxes or some type of literacy test. Every semester, I give my students a literacy test, one from Alabama. There's 60 questions in the literacy test. I give them 10. I've never had a student get all 10. I don't even think I've had a student get 6 right. These are highly educated students. We have convict leasing as well within the United States. Here's an image of a young African-American man who is being punished for some type of behavior, we don't know what. But convict leasing was a system of penal labor practiced in the South. Basically, convict leasing provided prisoner labor to individuals and industries, and it was highly profitable. This is basically how it would go. You might have a young African-American boy walking the street. You'd have a sheriff go and arrest him, claiming that he was a vagrant. Take him before a judge, and he would be sentenced. However, an industry, some type of corporation would come in and say, well, we'll go ahead and we'll lease him for a year, and we'll pay you, the state, in order to take him off your hands. But the really tricky thing is on the back end, many of these sheriffs actually received money for capturing these black individuals. It's a dirty system. Also, to recognize that employers had a small investment in these individuals. So they were treated horribly. There was little incentive to care for them whatsoever. They'd be working in the most wretched conditions, male and female alike. The practice was at its height around 1880 and actually wasn't abolished until 1941. So that's the lives of our grandparents. Maybe some of you were alive during that period of time. Many scholars say that really this was just a modern form of slavery. We also have lynching. This is a lynching of Thomas Ships and Abraham Smith in Indiana in 1930. They were taken from their jail cells, beaten, and hanged from a tree in the county courthouse. There was a crowd of around 5,000. You can see different ages, young men, women, seemingly having a good time. Children were present at these events. We've been able to chronicle around 4,000 documented lynchings within the U.S. from 1877 to 1950. One aspect of lynching that I'd like to share with you is kind of the triviality that it took to be lynched, that increased the threat, the terror threat of this activity, by sharing a few short stories. We have Private Charles Lewis. He was lynched after he refused to empty his pockets while wearing his Army uniform. We have Jeff Brown in Cedar Bluff. He accidentally bumped into a white girl as he was running to a train. Lynched. In 1940, Jesse Thornton, he was lynched for referring to a white police officer by his name without the title of Mr. So imagine you're in this environment. This is an environment of psychological terror, of psychological threat. We know that African Americans actually migrated in part from the South because of this threat of racial violence, moved to bigger cities like Chicago, New York, in order to escape this situation. This is another famous lynching of Jesse Washington. He was a black teenager. He's a farmhand, convicted of rape and murder. He was dragged out of the county court by observers and lynched in the Waco County City Hall. There were over 10,000 spectators at this event, including city officials, police. That's something to also recognize, is that social institutions that were ostensibly designed to protect citizens' rights were used in the process of lynching African Americans in the South. The members of the mob castrated Mr. Washington, cut off his fingers, hung him by a tree, lit a fire, and repeatedly lowered him into the fire in and out for a 2-hour period. After that point, they dragged his corpse throughout the town, and people removed body parts as souvenirs. This is shocking, but this is common. There was a niche industry around lynchings. This is a postcard of the lynching of Jesse Washington. Photographers would go and they would take images, put them on postcards, and then they would go door to door and sell them as souvenirs. This one reads, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left of the cross. Over it, your son, Joe." So this is Joe sending a postcard to his parents. Lynching was also supported at the kind of the highest levels of government. Here we have Senator Tom Watson from Georgia, 1913. He states, "In the South, we have to lynch him, the Negro, occasionally, and flog him now and then to keep him from blaspheming the Almighty by his conduct. On account of his smell and his color, lynch law is a good sign. It shows that a sense of justice yet lives among the people." This is just one example. There are many others. We also had segregation in basically all aspects: schooling, healthcare, cemeteries, residential location. In some areas, it was actually against the law to play a game with another individual. So if you're an adult white man, you have a black friend that you've maybe worked with, you couldn't play cards together. You know, the smallest intimate details of life were still being controlled. Areas of commerce as well. I'd like to share one story of racial violence that I believe many don't know about, but is a powerful example. This is the Tulsa riot. During the 19-teens, early 20s, Tulsa was considered Black Wall Street. There were black bankers and attorneys, physicians, and business owners. You can see in this image we have some African American men reading some books. We have African American youth in a parade. Just kind of a beautiful, everyday, vibrant African American life. Granted, Tulsa is incredibly segregated. There's white, black part of town, but blacks are faring incredibly well. What happened? 1921. A 19-year-old named Dickie Rowland, he was a black shoe shiner. He needed to use the restroom. So he went to a department store, and where he could use the restroom was at the top of the building, so he had to take the elevator. He goes in the elevator, comes back down. Somebody hears a scream. They run over, they see 17-year-old white elevator operator named Sarah Page, and Dickie Rowland kind of, they say, runs from the building. Well, Dick was arrested. So the newspaper caught this story, shared it around town. So by the afternoon, whites were basically riled up, and there was talk of a lynching occurring. So the black community began to hear about the potential lynching of Dick, and about 30 of them went to the jail, to the sheriff, and offered their support to help protect young Dick Rowland. Well, seeing this, about 1,000 whites left, went home, grabbed firearms, came back to the community jail. So this increased the crowd. They say estimates to about 2,000 whites. Well, about 75 blacks heard this, and they were like, no, not today. They grabbed arms, they went down. So, according to witnesses, a white man attempted to pull a pistol from an African American man. Shots were fired. We don't know which side, but that's when the melee began. Volleys back and forth. Blacks were retreating, but still fighting. Some accounts say that there were planes flying above, dropping bombs on black businesses and neighborhoods. Ultimately, the sheriff kind of deputized whites throughout the town, gave them firearms, and rounded up all blacks and put them in internment camps. African Americans were just murdered. There's a story of one who came out of his house with his hands up, and he was shot in cold blood on his lawn. We know upwards to about 300 died. 10,000 were left homeless. Next, we have the story of this young man, Emmett Till. Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy from Chicago, traveling to Mississippi to spend some time with his great uncle. Story goes, he's in a white family-owned little grocer, and that he supposedly whistled and flirted with Carolyn Bryant, 21-year-old wife of the owner. Several nights later, her husband, Roy, and his half-brother, J.W., went to Emmett's great-uncle's home, kidnapped him at gunpoint, beat him, tortured him, murdered him, took a 70-pound fan with barbed wire wrapped around his body and threw him in the Tallahatchie River. He was found 3 days later, and his body was transported to Chicago. If you've seen images of Emmett, you know that he doesn't look like this beautiful boy we see before us. However, this was a turning point in the civil rights movement. His mom, Mamie Till, had an open casket. Thousands of observers came. Now we're moving to kind of civil rights and after. Again, please keep in mind that the residual effects of slavery and Jim Crow are still being felt today. So even though we have kind of this legislation that has helped create a more equitable society, the residual effects of the 7/8 of overt discrimination towards African Americans still continues to this day. One place that we see that is in residential segregation. These are the Robert Taylor homes, completed in 1962, shut down in 2005. They're in Chicago on the south side. Basically, this was a black reservation. And we know that residential segregation can be a form of racial violence. What it does, it tends to concentrate African Americans in the poorest neighborhoods. We know that residential segregation is still very high in cities that have large black populations, like Chicago or Detroit. These poor neighborhoods are replete with crime, drug use, poor food quality, indigent schools, and toxic pollutants. These poor neighborhoods to this day exact a harsh penalty upon their residents. Next, we have mass incarceration. The U.S. has about 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. In 2014, African Americans constituted 2.3 million, or 34% of the total 6.8 million, the correctional population within the U.S. A few statistics for you. In 2008, black men aged 20 to 24 with less than a high school degree have close to a 40% chance of being incarcerated at one point in their life, compared to 12% of white men of similar age and educational attainment. One of the major challenges with mass incarceration, though, are the collateral consequences that come from being an incarcerated individual. What happens to you once you get out? Well, you can't vote. It's almost impossible to get loans. Very difficult to obtain housing, employment. This makes contributing to family life tenuous and fraught with challenges. This is Terrence Crutcher and his beautiful sister, Tiffany. Terrence, a 40-year-old black man, was killed by a police officer, Betty Jo Shelby, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, almost 100 years after the Tulsa massacre. He was unarmed during the encounter on the street, slowly walking back to his vehicle. They claimed that he was trying to get inside of his vehicle. There were 4 police officers there. One tased him, one shot him.
With his hands up.
With his hands up. I share this story about Terrence not to argue that every police officer is racist or has racial biases. However, what I am here to condemn is the historical amnesia about the legacy of racial violence towards blacks that partially contributes to racial bias in the criminal justice system. This bias teaches us, both white and black alike, to see black men and women as unruly, lawless, and dangerous. This has real impacts on the lives of black families who have to endure the psychological threat of violence or to try and survive physical violence itself. However, throughout all of this history, there are stories of black resilience. There are stories of black excellence and black resistance. I'm going to share one with you. His name is Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls is a 23-year-old slave who was conscripted into service by the Confederacy during the Civil War. He was aboard a warship called the Planter. For about a year, he observed the movements of everybody on the ship, and he developed a plan. With another individual, they decided to steal the ship. They told their family about this in the middle of the night. They pulled the anchor and eased the Planter into Charleston Harbor. They picked up their family members on the bank of the river. Together, they embarked on an extremely dangerous journey. Smalls had to navigate the ship past 4 Confederate checkpoints: Fort Castle Pinckney, Fort Ripley, Fort Johnson, and Fort Sumter. Smalls was brilliant. He mimicked the gait of the captain so as to deceive those keeping watch at each fort. So after successfully getting through these 4 checkpoints, he had to safely approach the vessels of the Union Naval blockading force. Luckily enough, they were not fired upon. So the astonished Union officials board the Planter. Smalls stood at attention, saluted, and spoke. "I am delivering this war material, including these cannons, and I think Uncle Abraham Lincoln can put them to good use." Smalls, he went on to serve the Union during the war, Beginning in 1868, he was elected member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. Then in 1875, he began his first term in the U.S. House of Representatives. Also, he was an incredibly successful businessman in the railway industry and owned and helped operate his own newspaper. So in closing, I'd like to share a quote from Maya Angelou. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Thank you.
Okay, let me put my glasses on so I can see. Good morning. Let me say that a little bit better. Good morning. All right, there we go. First, let me apologize for being inappropriately dressed. I wasn't thinking this morning. I forgot about really the conference that I was attending, and I wore a blue shirt instead of a red one. At least I could have worn a neutral color, but I'm really glad to be here today to talk about this subject. And I'm appreciative of my colleague for laying the context of kind of my talk so I don't have to touch much on the history of racial violence, racial intolerance, but just talk about the present day and really focus on that. I should say that I've had a healthy appreciation for the Mormon Church and for Black Mormons. So I come to this research from a pretty objective standpoint. No axe to grind, just really wanting to understand the Black Mormon experience. So this study is part of a bigger project. I've been interviewing Blacks in Utah for the last year. And so what you'll see in this presentation is just a subset of a little bigger part of that project of looking at Blacks, but looking here at Black Mormons. So I'm going to walk through, what I hope to do today is to walk through some of the concepts that I use to try to analyze these interviews, racial microaggression, racial battle fatigues, structural discrimination, and things like that. And what I'd like for you to do is just to suspend your biases for a moment and try to listen with compassion, to really feel and understand the humanity that one must have to persist in systems as Dr. Gabriel talked about, but to try to serve your God and still be ridiculed in your service, to profess a religious practice and not be fully treated as human, to love your brothers and sisters and oftentimes not be loved in return. So as you listen to these quotes, I want you to just think about their humanity. Because what I really appreciated in doing these interviews is the perseverance, the hope, the endless hope that Black Mormons have. The hope that what they're doing is the right thing for the God that they serve. The hope that other people will catch up to where they are. So I'll walk you through some of the things that sets the foreground to how I interpreted the data. So my expertise is not in Mormon studies. It is not in religion. It is in race-related stress, racial microaggressions, racial battle fatigue. And so that I don't profess to really understand fully the whole Mormon experience, and particularly the whole Black Mormon experience. So what I try to do is just to hear my subjects tell me their stories and interpret that from a race-related stress analytical framework. Okay? And so again, this is just a small part of the Mormon sample, Black Mormon sample, that I'll be talking about today. So stress is a reaction. It's a medical or biological, physical reaction, emotional reaction, mental reaction that causes your body to be out of balance. You might have remembered in high school about homeostasis. So when you're under stress, it's an attack. When you experience racism, it's like the body is experiencing violence. Okay? It's a violent attack. Think about it as, you remember Hank Aaron, the home run king. So every racial microaggression that a person goes through, the racism that they experience, it's like Hank Aaron swinging that bat, and the body receives that blow as a violent attack. They receive it as a psychological attack, an emotional attack, and they have a behavioral response that they have to deal with. How do I cope with this? How do I find some form of resilience to persist? So that's the stress that people have to deal with in general. But when you add race into it, it becomes a violent attack. Dr. Chester Pierce is a Harvard psychologist. He's actually a professor emeritus. He passed 2 years ago, and he was one of my mentors that helped me to think through some of the things about racial battle fatigue. He's the one that gave us racial microaggressions. And what he said about racial microaggressions is that they're the most offensive actions are not gross and crippling. They are subtle and stunning. The enormity of the complexity, let me use my glasses. I'm right at that stage where my eyes have started to go bad, and I'm not used to lecturing using readers, but so I'll make it through. So the enormity of the complications can be appreciated only when one considers that these subtle blows are delivered incessantly. Racism in the United States is a public health and mental health illness. He goes on to talk about the reader must bear in mind that these racial assaults to Black dignity and Black hope are incessant and cumulative. Any single one may be gross. In fact, the major vehicle for racism in this country is offenses done to Blacks by whites in this sort of gratuitous, never-ending way. So how do I define racial microaggressions? Those who are racially marginalized are often experience various forms of racial microaggressions. Racial microaggressions are one form of systemic, everyday racism used to keep people in their racial place or on the racial margins. So they're subtle, verbal and nonverbal insults or assaults. They're layered insults and assaults. And they're cumulative. Daryl Wing Sue went on to say that microaggressions are everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional. And they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So in this case, race. So it's some examples: racial slights, recurrent indignities and irritations, stigmatization, hypersurveillance, attacks on one's well-being, exclusion. Racial microaggressions and Black Latter-day Saints. What I found in my interviews is that they experience all three of these forms of racial microaggressions. Micro-insults, which are often unconscious. Micro-assaults, which are also often conscious level attacks. And micro-invalidation, which are unconscious. So those verbal comments or behaviors that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings of persons of color. And you'll see through some of these quotes that those micro-invalidations, those micro-assaults, and those micro-insults are layered through their responses. So combined, all of these racial microaggressions impacts our body, our mind, our emotions, and our behaviors. And these are some of the types of responses that we will have. So you have to remember that when you're under extreme stress, and when you're a Black Mormon, you have to deal with society at large, and we'll talk about a little bit of that later. And then you have to deal with something that you also love and that you attend, and that is the LDS Church. And when you're constantly having to respond to those stresses, your body is out of whack. Headaches, stomach aches, lack of sex drive, lack of hunger, losing weight, gaining weight. I see people over there testifying already. I'm still not finished with surveying and interviewing, so if you want to help complete this data, I'm still taking people to sign up. So, my research over the last 20 years has been on racial battle fatigue. And what is racial battle fatigue? Racial battle fatigue is that stress overload. It's a psychological, physiological stress overload from specific race-related relationships between a racially marginalized group, Blacks, and his or her environment. So it invalidates people's experiences and keeps them on the defense. So that's psychological, emotional trauma. Okay? How are Blacks perceived in Utah? Now, obviously Utah has a stereotype. Some of those things are true. Some of those things are not true. But when I tell people I'm from Utah, well, I'm not from Utah, I'm from Chicago. That's what I tell them. I correct them real quick. I say I live in Utah. Correct. But I'm from Chicago. Yes. All right? But when I tell them that I've lived in Utah for 21 years, this is how they look at me. All right? So, some of you already know where this is from, but they look at me like this. But when you tell them that you're Black and Mormon and in Utah, what do they say? That's how they look at you. Like, there's a problem if you're Black in Utah, living in Utah. And then if you're Black and Mormon and living in Utah, it's a double problem, all right? Now, part of the larger study that I've done on, not just on Black Mormons, but on Blacks in general, many have given, like in graduate school, in my department, if you get a C or C minus, that's like failing, right? We expect you to get A's and B's. So most Blacks have given Utah a C minus. on various factors.
On a curve.
On a curve, all right. Yeah, some have curved it. So, but what they'll say next is, "But I'm staying." Right. So what blacks tend to do is they balance out the difficulties, the trauma that they experience, the injustices that they feel, and they say, "I have coping mechanisms, and I feel that I can persist through that." Whether it's their faith in God, whether it's their connections to community, whether it's a social network that they have, whether it's another organization that they belong to, whether it's listening to Marvin Gaye, whether it's Luther Vandross, they are connected and grounded that makes them persist. And that's something that we don't give credit to most black people, that they have to go beyond the curve to deal with maintaining their psychological and physiological health. White folks, our brothers and sisters in the white community, rarely have to think about race. Rarely have to think about when I walk or drive or talk, how am I going to be perceived? And if I'm going to be perceived to a larger group stereotype. That gets exhausting, right? So, I'm going to talk about 3 of my participants. Now, we need a visual. We need a visual. So, I want you to, since this is an anonymous study group, I can't give you the real names or images of the individuals, but you'll remember these folks. So Dixon has been a Mormon for 3 decades. He was converted into the Mormon church, so about 53% of his life, and he's married, born in the USA. Beth has also been in the Mormon church for 3 decades, about 59% of her life, also born in the USA. And the Black Panther, G, has also been a Mormon for 3 decades and born a Mormon, so 100% of his life married and born in Africa. Okay. So here are some of the survey findings, at least from these 3. When I asked how much discrimination do you experience from non-black LDS members, you can see that it varies here. So 1 is leaning closer to substantial, 1 says substantial, and there's 1 who's right in the middle. So these experiences are not all the same, and you'll see that. So there's no one feeling that all black Mormons have. The system, the society approaches them very differently. Some based on their phenotype, right? Some based on their gender. What is a black woman like stereotypically in the larger society, and how do they have to navigate that stereotype? Or what is a black man like? What is a tall black man like? 6'3", I'm 6'3", I represent the top 3% of U.S. men's height in the country. But many whites will perceive me like I'm 6'8", an additional 60 pounds, and 30 more pounds of muscle, and intimidating, and violent. So you won't find consistent responses in the survey, in general surveys, like when we take the general social survey. Matter of fact, are you going to Philadelphia?
I'm not this year.
Okay, you're
taking a break.
Okay, I was hoping to see you.
Not fatigued, just the chat.
He's a sociologist in the Association for Black Sociologists, and American Sociological Association meeting is in Philadelphia, so I was hoping I could take you to lunch. You missed out.
I'll take you about it.
So, You can see also with how much institutional discrimination do you experience within the LDS Church, church's practices or traditions. That is buried there as well. How much discrimination do you believe other black LDS members face at a structural level within the LDS Church? And you can see that one respondent was saying almost substantial, while the other ones were right in the middle. Do you believe that things have gotten better for LDS black members since the 78 revelation? And again, it's buried there. Some are very substantial improvements. One is right in the middle, moderate. Do you believe that the LDS Church has struck the right balance on race relations within the LDS Church? One respondent did not answer, and the other ones were closer to too little. But the interesting thing is that person who didn't respond here later responded in the interview, okay? And we'll get to that. And do you believe the LDS Church is misunderstood or discriminated against more than any other religious group? So some said disagree, some said agree, and some said neither agree or neither disagree. So it's mixed opinions there as well. And do you believe that having more blacks, African Americans, and other racial ethnic groups in the LDS Church will improve the overall religion organization? Some say agree strongly, some say disagree, and again, that is mixed, but in the interviews, all of them said that they thought there should be more diversity in the church. So I see that there's a trilogy of oppression amongst black LDS members. One is this institutionalized racism, and this is so small on my screen, is a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. Institutional racism is also racism by individuals or informal social groups governed by behavioral norms that support racist thinking and foment active racism. There's also structural discrimination. And that occurs in a society when an entire network of rules and practices disadvantages less empowered groups while serving at the same time to advantage the dominant group. And lastly, this anti-black racism. And I use Ta-Nehisi Coates here as a definition for anti-black racism because I think it's really important, and you hear this in their quotes. If there's one thing missing in our country, it's an acknowledgement. And that's what I kept hearing from Black Latter-day Saints, is that they want an acknowledgement for what they've experienced and what they continue to experience. So this acknowledgement of the broad humanity of black folks. Racism and anti-black racism in particular is the belief that there's something wrong with black people. Not something wrong with you, not something wrong with the society, but it's something wrong with black people. Now, let's go back to Dr. Gabe. 5 minutes? Oh, Lord. Let's go quick. All right. See, let me just tell you one thing about professors. It's hard to speak for 25 minutes. It's like I heard Mormon bishops take a long time to talk, and Baptist preachers take a long time to talk, but professors do too. So I was just warming up. I might need to take 5 of your minutes, okay? So, what do you think about blacks not having full privileges in the LDS Church pre-1978? So let me just pull them all up. And one of the things I liked about Dixon there is, he said, it didn't mean anything to me. People said it, but I was like, oh, there's racism in the LDS Church? Am I in America? Now, one of the things that I found in interviewing many of the subjects was that some had a strong racial identity that was rooted in this African centricity. Some had given more premiums to a white social identity, white racial identity. Those who did that tended to have more problems, less hope, less struggle. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not less struggle, but more struggle that they had to deal with in an internal way, right? Those who had this strong, say, well, I know where I live. You see that what Dr. Gabriel presented to us, at no time in our history of the country has anyone sat down and talked to whites coming out of that tradition and did some type of wholesale counseling. How do you move from lynching? And one of the things that part of the lynching and the auction blocks did was give us the concept of picnics. Pick a nigger. Picnics. You sit down, you eat with your family, and you pick a nigger, right? So that is the construction of picnics. But yet, so that's celebrated. How do you go from that kind of psychology to a healthy psychology dealing with blacks? I only have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to run through some of these things. Responses to racism and other religious faiths versus the LDS. Some said no difference. One of the major differences was the wards and how you have to go to the ward that you live in. And if your ward had an anti-black sentiment, what do you do to escape? If you're a Black Baptist, you can go to any Baptist church, but you're basically isolated to the behaviors and attitudes of the people in that community. So those were many of the responses for that. The apology, let me put them up here. Many felt that the church needs to apologize. They've asked for an apology from the state of Missouri. The governor gave it. Is that my 5 minutes?
My bad. Go, you good, you good.
Okay.
Professor?
They didn't, but they weren't hopeful. They said it's not going to happen. All right? 3 major reasons why the church should apologize. And again, it was the Missouri asking for that apology because they feel that the Mormon church is hypocritical to ask for it in that context and not expect to give one in the context that they had. Now, what I would say is I've also interviewed ex-Black Mormons and a few whites, and I find that there's more white Mormons that tend to be very upset about the lack of apology than some of the Black Mormons that I've interviewed. We can maybe talk about that later. The hoax, they were upset with the person who made the fake website, right? Because they felt that this person knew that there was an injury in the Black community, the Black LDS community, and took advantage of that hurt and pain because the wounds had not healed. And that was being callous and exploitive. And so they felt that that was hurtful. But when I pushed them in that conversation, they then retracted back to, but yes, there was an injury before the hoax, and that injury needs to be addressed. Let me move forward because I don't want my moderator to get the hook on me. Right. Let me get to the, we'll skip whiteness, and I'll get to the recommendations. So what must the LDS Church do today to fully repent and heal, not just for black members, but for all members? So, a public, honest, heartfelt apology that is sincere from the top leaders of the church and put in a proclamation where you can hang it from the wall. So it can be referred to. Those black members who feel alienated can then feel that progress is being made. This will go a long way. They must verbally say it at General Conference, like the Declaration, and then sent out to all bishops of the wards. It should be treated like the public apology when they ask members to come back to the church. And I had to skip that, but there was apparently some apology that the leadership in the church made of any hurt or damage that it had done to members, and asked them to come back and ask for atonement and forgiveness. And if you can do that, then why can't you do this for black members? More inclusion of people of color in top leadership positions. Remove all of the lies from all of the teaching manuals. Create a diverse committee that can go through all of the manuals and take out known lies or do not use them until this is done. Require every ward to meet where the official letter from the First Presidency is read by the bishops with instructions about what behaviors are unacceptable and discussions about racism and white supremacy is taught. These conditions should also be required for temple reckoning. People should not be allowed to enter the temple if they believe that blacks are inferior to whites or hold any other racist notions. And before I sit down, I should just say, for G, who is from Africa, and I didn't get a chance to talk about African versus African Americans, but he had to learn how to become African American because he was perceived as African American, and all of the stereotype and hatred and venom that is embodied in the black body was put on him when he had no understanding about that. And he had been in his ward for 2 years and never received a home visit, home teaching. 2 years. So one of the respondents said that had to be deliberate. So when you can go through those type of experiences, you can see that the heavy weight of racial microaggressions is put on black LDS members, and racial battle fatigue is high. Sorry for taking too long, but that is the story.
Thank you, Dr. Gabriel. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Now we've got about 15 to 20 minutes for myself and Tekulve to give a response or just to add our ideas and experiences to this discussion. Both Tekulve and I are licensed therapists, so you'll be hearing probably some clinical things that come from us as we talk about how we see it. So, Tekulve, I will go ahead and let you start off. I will wrap up at the conclusion of your remarks.
So the first thing that I'm going to mention is on the program, I'm listed as representing LDS Family Services. That's going to not be the case because what I'm going to say might not be consistent with LDS Family Services. I am not here as a church employee, have not been for 4 years, so I'm going to say what I want to say. Having said that, the American Psychological Association in the DSM states that in order to meet the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, that the actual trauma does not need to be experienced by the individual, but they can have close proximity to that trauma. And so when you think about things like Emmett Till, the Tulsa massacres and things like that, those are stories that even though they are decades removed from us, those are stories that we grow up hearing. And so that trauma for us is very real. And so on a very real basis, if I were to create a diagnostic criteria for racism-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, I could make a case for 85 to 90% of African Americans, and the others are just lying. So I put it that way. One of the things that stood out to me in listening kind of took me back to a couple that I saw in graduate school. It was a black couple. I'm sorry, I use the term black because I like it. So there was a black couple that had come to our clinic for couples counseling, and the husband was explaining to the wife kind of the stressors that he feels as a black man in the South, and was like, I need you to have my back. Well, I was the only black student in this practicum, and so I stepped into the role of cultural ambassador, one that you have to play quite often here in Utah. And so I was trying to explain to my white teacher and colleagues kind of what it was like to be a black male in the South, even in the early 2000s, and the response from my teacher was, "Surely you don't believe that." Me and Jesus and the Holy Ghost had a moment. And so there are frequent moments where our experience as black people are not validated, or we're told that we're just making this stuff up. And nowhere is that more apparent here in Utah than when you look at the African American experience in the LDS Church. Now, I'm going to say this just so we don't get it twisted. I have a testimony of the gospel. I believe it to be true. I'm not trying to leave the church, but I'm going to make the church more comfortable for me. So some people might be a little uncomfortable by the time I shut up. Okay? Number one, we have to make a distinction between the African American experience in the church and the African experience in the church. And as African American church members, we are beyond tired of being asked to look at the history of the church as if we are African members of the church. Because one, they did not grow up with the same history with white people as we grew up with. Number two, we did not look to the church to come into our villages or our neighborhoods and save us from whatever impoverished conditions you may have envisioned Africa to be. You all came up in our neighborhoods knocking on our doors in your white shirt and ties. We were great at First Missionary Baptist Church. We were praising the Lord. It was all cool. And so there is this thought in the church as if the gospel comes and saves black people from being ignorant, but we were doing great. In fact, if anything, we have added to the greatness of the gospel. So I think there needs to be some acknowledgement of the contributions of black American members of the church to whatever greatness we're going to attribute to the church. I think that our B1 celebration on the first of the month was a step towards that, but it was not a cure-all. It was just opening the door. Wait a minute, number two, number three. I can't even keep up.
2.5.
You all don't understand. I've been a member of the church since 1990, and I've had all this stuff just like waiting for this moment. So, while serving as Black Student Union president at BYU, there was an article in the Daily Universe celebrating the increase in numbers of black students at BYU from 128 to 144. It was not an uncommon thing for me to be asked, "What number are you?" And if y'all know me, my pettiness has no limit. And so I figured, well, I just got to campus, maybe I'm like number 139, number 140, like, what are you talking about? But there was the assumption that as an African-American student at BYU, I was there to play sport. My sport was graduation.
Okay.
Like, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to graduate. But there was this, assumption that if you were black at BYU, you were there to play sports. I wish I had a nickel, even a nickel, for every time on campus I was told, you speak English very well. Like, have you met my mama? Like, absolutely we speak English well. Or even now, I wish I had a nickel for every time either I'm in the temple or I'm in some church function and some chronologically advanced person, I'm not going to call him old, chronologically advanced person who has served a mission in Africa approaches me and speaks some language to me other than the one that I speak. In fact, this just happened just the other day. Some random person came up to me and greeted me in Swahili, and I just looked at him like, I'm going to wait until you speak English. Like, but that type of thing happens to us often, and yeah, we've gotten to the point where we can laugh those things off, but I think those things add to this racial battle fatigue syndrome that we experience like on a daily basis. And then it's subtle things like who has been sitting in general conference and Elder Holland, because I'm going to give a shout out to Uncle Jeff. Elder Holland says something that really resonates with you, and you've had to catch yourself because you can't say amen or you can't clap. But those are the ways that we as African Americans were taught, like this is how we worship. But then we are taught that no, that is not reverent, that is not appropriate or whatever. And so then when you look at the church or religion as a social institution that serves two purposes. One, to answer the unanswerable, and number two, to separate the sacred from the profane, but everything in our culture is labeled by the church as a social institution as being profane. Well, how is that supposed to feel?
Right.
I mean, sometimes I might want to do the Holy Ghost two-step, when we finally sing a hymn on tempo. Maybe I want to clap, And so there's so much of who we are as people culturally that is looked upon from the standpoint of the church as not being sacred enough, appropriate enough, reverent enough, and whatever. And so, but yet we find a way to stay. And it almost looks like religious Stockholm syndrome. Because those of us who do stay find ourselves in this place of making an excuse for the people who are holding us emotionally hostage. Can I
2 minutes.
Can I use that term?
You may as well.
Okay. It is my clinical judgment that the way the church is structured, I'll put it that way, looks a lot like emotional terrorism. It looks like emotional hostage taking. And then we are told that we cannot call it terrorism because the terrorists are offended by the use of the word terrorist. So what are we supposed to do? You know what I mean? So it's like we can't even acknowledge that the problem is the problem because the people who are the problem are offended by being told, hey, you're part of the problem. In fact, not only that, I think Dr. Smith mentioned, in fact, we are told, you know what? The problem is your blackness. You people are too loud. You people are too animated. You people are too irreverent. irreverent. And that is a word that is psychologically damaging as well, because in our cultural context, reverence is this holy thing. And so if you are looked at as being irreverent, you are offensive to God. So how are you going to tell children, you are offensive to your daddy? Like there is something in you that is offensive to the person who created you. And so I think we really have to look at the language that we use in the church and the messages that it sends to people of color, particularly African Americans, about kind of where their place is in this church and the contributions that they have made to the church. And with that, I'm going to do like my granddaddy say, I'm going to speak up. No, stand up, speak up, and shut up.
Right. Thank you. So that we have time for question and answer with the large group here, I will make my remarks very brief. I would be remiss not to tell you who I am, because I got people that'll be upset with me for not introducing myself. I'm Dr. LaShawn Williams. I'm an assistant professor at Utah Valley University in our social work program. I've been a social worker for 17 years and a member of the church all my life. My research interests based on the black family experience in the LDS Church, cultural competence with social work professionals, teaching people to be culturally competent therapists and social professional helpers. So I'm pleased to have moderated with you all today. This has been a pleasure and an honor. I will wrap up with a few thoughts. We are 24 days from Pioneer Day, July 24th. Every single year we celebrate Pioneer Day in the state of Utah, and we do so to remember the plight of Mormons after the Missouri Extermination Act. One of the Extermination Act, one of the acts that led to Mormons being expelled from Missouri was the Hans Mill Massacre of 1838, I believe, where a number, around 17 people were killed at this massacre simply for being Mormon. Non-fatal injuries were around 20, including the perpetrators, and there were about 240 angry Missourians that attacked and killed Mormons at Hans Mill Massacre. What is racial battle fatigue for the Black Latter-day Saint? It is being able to celebrate Pioneer Day every year for a massacre of 17 people and not being able to talk about the transatlantic slave trade that massacred and was genocidal in its effect for upwards of 15 to 20 million black people across this world. One of the things that we have to be aware of is that Christianity is the religion of the colonizer, and in doing so, as committing ourselves as Christians in this religion, we do so having a double consciousness on an ongoing, daily, minute-by-minute basis. One of the things that I loved from being able to research some of the writings of the scholars here on stage with me was what is called the MEs. They're the mundane, extreme, environmental stress that are experienced by black people on a regular and ongoing basis. And so with that, it is important, it's critical to understand that there are mundane, environmental, extreme stressors that black people in the LDS Church face without the remorse of our fellow members who call us brother and sister but do not act very familial, brotherly or sisterly, without any remorse, without any restitution, without any reconciliation, without any recognition. And for me, as a member of the church, my entire life, battling and walking through that is exhausting. It's the reason why I wore my Whitley Gilbert t-shirt today, Relax, Relate, Release, because that's what I have to do every single Sunday when I walk into a church building, is remind myself there's going to be a moment where I got to say relax, relate, release. You're here to worship Jesus, and the people that he created are going to be his problem and not yours. You can't do that to yourself today. So one of the things that I think is always challenging for me as a member of the church is recognizing that we pride ourselves on being in the world but not of the world, and that's fantastic. That's a good thing to be, because the world in which the LDS Church was founded and created was at the height of chattel slavery in the United States of America. What's difficult is that we saw ourselves as proclaiming this brand new gospel, but we maintained worldly views on race. How do you proclaim that you have this brand new gospel and this access to this new information that you can see Jesus differently, but you see black folk the same way everybody else does? Something is off, and you can't have it both ways. Secondly, You think about this convenient minority status that Mormons have in the church, that whenever there's this discussion of religious freedom, here come Mormons saying, but religious freedom is super important, we support that because we have a history of being targeted because of our religious practices and preferences, right? That Mormon card gets played regularly, right? But then if I speak up about race, it's the race card. But you know what? I can't play the Mormon card. I cannot. There's nowhere that I go where I play the Mormon card and it gets me any sympathy besides, baby, you sure you won't be in that church? Okay? So I can play one but not the other, and that's one of the realizations that you come to see. Mormonism is not a religion, but it is a race. And one of the things that Mormons fought most often was not being racialized in their history, and they did so by distancing themselves from all racial groups. And one of the things that we have to acknowledge as black members of the church and as non-black members of the church and the society is that we exist on a white and black continuum. And so even if you are not black, you are judged by how close you are to black. Your treatment is based on how close you are to black. So you recognize that your survival is based on, I might not be white, but I'm not black. Mormons might not be white, but we're not black. And so as they establish themselves in this definition of themselves and chasing whiteness, that's part of the history that we're facing in 2018. Situationally dependent my Mormonism, that those get out quotes, there's the key piece of the movie is that one of the villains in the movie, she stirs a teacup to induce hypnosis for black people, for the black person, the black protagonist of the film. And there's tea stirring in the LDS Church. That means that there are phrases that you hear that put you into the right type of behavior to be a good Mormon. Whenever I walk into any sort of congregation, folks will look at me and they will try and understand, what kind of black person am I? Sure, I'm Mormon, but what kind of black person is she? Is she a Black Lives Matter black person, or is she an okay black Mormon? Is she going to make me uncomfortable with her blackness? That's an ongoing conversation and struggle that most black members that I'm aware of, at least here in the United States, have to endure. And there's this piece from one of Dr. Smith's articles, and it talks about the stressors that we have to face and how complicated it is. And I want to give this to you. We have to endure these 3 stressful and enduring psychological sequelae in historically white spaces. 1, blacks have to spend mental energy considering whether they are genuinely accepted or just being tolerated. 2, blacks use mental and emotional energy discerning the difference between individually supportive whites and destructive actions by whites as a collective. 3, blacks confront additional and unique race-based stress identifying when, where, and how to resist oppression versus when, where, and how to accommodate to it. We are consistently in this place of figuring out, do I say something because I know I need to say something because this is racist, or I just need to get through the 3rd-hour block, I just need to go home, I done made it through 2.5 hours, I'm gonna let Sister so-and-so just go on ahead and believe what she believes because I don't really feel like negatively impacting the chronically advanced in my congregation, right? But the tea stirring, to be aware of the phrases that are used, that are weaponized against us in very, very nice and well-meaning and well-intentioned ways, understand what it does to us. It tells us to behave. It is things like, it was God's plan. This is in God's timing. We don't know why. You just have to trust that God is in charge. You need to pray. You need to look forward. Don't look backwards. We need to put down our weapons. We need to not be angry. Contention is of the devil. All of these things say to us that our experiences are not allowed. Our grief and our pain and our struggle is not permitted in the walls where we all go to seek healing. I know that if I struggled with a medical issue, I could bring that to church and I could cry. As a divorcee, I know that I can go into church and I can say, this is really difficult. My eternal marriage has ended, and I can get support. I can't go in when another black person is killed by the cops, and I can't be upset, and I can't grieve that at church yet. My goal, my hope, my desire, my charge, my request is that our churches and our spaces become places where we can lay our burdens down on the altar, and that you sacrifice with us, that you mourn with us, that you see us. If I am Sister Williams, treat me like you mean it. Thank you. We have 5 sacred minutes for question and answer between now and 10:30. Just use your outside voices. Yes, go for it.
Okay, this for Dr. Smith in particular. So, when you said that you interviewed people and more white people are upset about the ban. It's a very leading question, by the way. You said more white people were upset about the ban that had left than black people were. Do you feel that it may be because black people are used to being wronged and we never get apologies, and white people are maybe not used to that and they're used to getting apologies? Or just throw it out there. I don't know, leading.
No, I think it's that and more. I really believe that, as Dixon said, I'm in America, right? So I've tolerated oppression. I've tolerated black people being killed innocently. There was a recent study that showed that after a black man, unarmed, is shot by the police, how mental health issues increases dramatically in those black communities. When they looked at whites, no change, right? When the person was armed and killed, then both whites and black responded the same. The first response is to systemic racism, right? So psychologically, it heals us. But what happens also is that we have adaptive coping strategies and maladaptive coping strategies. Oftentimes, we'll use maladaptive. So we'll try to psych ourselves out to believe it doesn't matter when our body is a human lie detector. And so if I basically take your pulse, I know the truth. Okay? So in order to persist, black people can't always depend on white reactions and white responses. So you're right that white people, when they get on that, in that train, on that line, they might appear to be more offended than blacks are, but internally we've struggled with that for centuries. So we know what America is.
And has always been. Yes.
So, and I would like to say what, I had written down two things in my notebook, Stockholm Syndrome and John Henryism. And I've seen that in some of these interviews, that it's a continuum that Black Latter-day Saints face, and that is this continuum with Stockholm Syndrome and also this kind of John Henryism, where they got to out-Mormon Mormons.
Yes.
Right? And it's the same thing in my larger study, where black people have to be the best that they can possibly be to outperform white people, because they have to be twice as good to get half as far. So they can't make a mistake. And so when I sit back and as an objective non-Mormon, I'm saying, okay, I see what's going on. My counseling psych background is very useful in that manner, but that's stressful, very stressful.
The American Psychological Association doesn't recognize a condition that people refer to as racial identity disorder. It's not included in the, in spite of efforts, it's not included in the DSM-5. Do you believe that there is such a disorder?
You mean like Rachel Dolezal?
I believe that it is disordered, for sure.
Well, do you believe it should be recognized by the American Psychological Association?
Absolutely not. Because I think that the problem is everybody wants to be black until it's time to be black. Okay? And we have to not get into the business of giving a legitimate voice to foolishness. And that is foolishness. Because if I were to come to you and say, when I look in the mirror, I see a white man, and I feel at my very core that I am a white man, there is a padded room at uni with my name on it.
It's Dave Chappelle, if you remember. It's Dave Chappelle,
right.
yeah.
But what is interesting, though, when a member of a marginalized group feels that they have a full membership into the non-marginalized group, that's crazy. But people who feel like they have a timeshare in our blackness can come in and vacation, and we're supposed to say, oh yeah, sure, yeah, let's go ahead and give her a black card. No, that's foolishness. And that's my personal opinion. Like, I think that's foolishness, because it is as if to say blackness is something that you can put on and take off, and it's not. Blackness is more than just, brown skin or coarse hair or full lips or curves or whatever. Blackness is a history that you cannot pick up at Costco on wholesale. Like, it is a history that is in your DNA, which is why we say just a drop, right? Because even a drop of that history puts you in that category. And people who do not have that history, I am trans wealthy. I woke up this morning and I felt like a millionaire. Until I go and try to spend that million, then someone is going to check me real quick. So we just can't say, well, this is how I feel, and therefore this is what I am. And I feel like people like Rachel and other people with this transracial stuff, no, that's not, no.
They're intellectual versus experiential. I can read about it and I can know, but I haven't felt or experienced. So it's navigating those two things in a very honest and authentic way.
And it is also biological. If you study, and I don't mean biological differences between races, I'm not going down that road, but if you look at epigenetics,
trauma.
Yeah, there's trauma that can be passed down based upon what your mama,
yes,
your big mama,
yes,
your great-great-grandmama experienced. And so we need to understand psychological, emotional trauma. And so you can't just, you called it what do you call it, a timeshare into the black community? It's worse than that. It's an Airbnb.
Yes.
It's just taking up residency for a moment, living in somebody else's house, and then you get to leave and go back to, the big house.
Do one or two more before Paul stops us. This historical accuracy of white men being in power of black speech and discussion. Go ahead.
LaShawn, I love what you said about laying down our weapons and some of these suggestions for blacks to heal themselves and to get over past hurts and to not be offended feel to me very much like blaming the victim. How do we change that conversation? What strategies, if any, do you have for us to change that conversation? Because clinically, as I've heard you all speak, there are some mental health issues involved with what we deal with if we are to accept that victim blaming. What can we do?
I think part of it means that we don't have to do anything. That's for white people. But they need... Well, my billable hours, I'm like $150 an hour.
Can I?
What I can suggest is white people need to know their history. And white Mormons, I will say it often, that we began our gospel in our church here in the U.S. as one of the boldest that I can think of in the history of the U.S. And we cannot lose that boldness. And I believe that the LDS Church is very soon coming to a crossroads to understand who it really is and who it really wants to be versus who it says that it is. It has this very, very close proximity to whiteness, but as you saw when the Mormon Tabernacle Choir was invited to sing for the 45th administration here in the United States of America, they caught heat for being Mormon. Mormons are one step away from being relegated to nothing, and they recognize that. Are they willing to renounce their white privilege? That becomes, it's an institutional white privilege that we have as a church. Are we willing to renounce it? Are we willing to really be numbered with the marginalized? Because that's where the Mormon church, I believe, will actually have its power, is by standing with people that it has the history of distancing itself from. And it can't do that if it does not know its history. And it's not just Mormon white people, but like Mormons as a collective group who have experienced oppression. If anybody would know how to succor and suffer those who have been oppressed, it should be Mormons. Why we do not do that, I don't know. That my suggestion is to learn that history and to understand we're comfortable in our whiteness right now, but that whiteness came at a cost to your humanity, your integrity, your spirituality, and the profession of your mission in this world. And that is something to reconcile. It has to be done. And I think as Mormons speak up about immigration, but didn't speak up about Charleston and racial violence there, we can speak up about families being separated there, but not families being separated through slavery. Like, we got to stop this dissonance also. Learning our history is part of that. And without a learning of our history, and it's not going to be a top-down thing. The top has gotten information. It's gotten history books from our scholars. It's gotten information about who we are and what we have. The top hasn't done it. If it's not us, I don't know how it's going to happen. If you can't find white Mormons who have done it, go look at white people in U.S. history who have fought against it. I can't teach you. I'm not white. I don't know what it's like to have privilege on a convenient, whenever I want to have it, I can use it. If not, I don't have to worry about it. Like, I was just showing Dr. Gabriel that 3 senators have introduced an anti-lynching bill. There have been 200 introduced over the course of the country's history. Here's one more from Cory Booker, Tim Scott, a Republican in South Carolina, and Kamala Harris. So two Democrats and 1 Republican. It has the support of Mitch McConnell, but Mitch McConnell said this when they were talking about the law. He said, I thought we already had one. I thought we did that many years ago. I hadn't really thought about it. I thought that was done back during LBJ or some period like that. That's what y'all got to reconcile with, is folks who have never had to think about it. We live this every day. You have to think about it now. You got to find folks that can teach you to do it. They're in this room. They do this work. Go and let them teach you. We have enough, I think, to carry, and I can't carry you too. I want to, but I can't anymore. So that's my personal opinion.
I think you offer a fantastic question. I think it's a very important question. I was trained as a demographer, and one of the things we learn about demography is that population attitudes shift through cohorts. So we're born into a cohort, those cohorts move along, they live and they die. Look at what's happening around here. There's an increasing change, a younger generation of young blacks and whites, Latinos and Asians who care about these issues. They're going to be moving into positions of a Relief Society president. They're going to be moving into positions of a bishop. We're teaching classes, numerous ones at BYU, that tell the truth. Like the stuff I talked about today, I talked about to my students. And we're seeing transformations of hearts and minds. So I'm not saying be patient, but I'm saying that this cohort thing is happening behind the scenes as well. So I think there's something good there too.
I think also we need to, as a church, acknowledge how psychologically damaging some of our standards are to African American women in particular. So we teach our young men to look for qualities in future spouses that as African American women would be absolutely dangerous to have. And so we need to start there, because we do this, hey, you want a wife who's going to stay at home and one who's going to look, because no, that's not the way my mama raised my sister. And, before I got married, I was thinking, and that is also not the way that I hope that my mother-in-law is raising my future wife. And so some of those qualities and attributes that make black women strong black women, we are taught as black males in the church to look at as, I don't know if you want that, but hey, if somebody's going to have my back, I want them to be able to know how to roll up their sleeves and work with me. Like, I don't need cookies in the morning. I can handle that. You know what I mean? But we are taught some of those things that make black women strong, some of those attributes that have allowed black women to support black men through the oppression that we face from a church standpoint, we're talking, no, those are not the attributes that are going to build Zion. And we need to first acknowledge that and to discontinue that.
Dismantle, thank you. Okay, I believe we are out of time, but totally not out of interest and conversation. Let's go ahead and conclude this panel. Thank you, and we'll get ready for the next. Thank you. You guys are awesome. Awesome work. I know. We do a whole conference. Hey, absolutely.
I'm not used to 25 minutes.
Set up the next one.
The conversation started.
You moderating?
I think it was a good kickoff presentation.
It's one of the things that virtue mentioned in the leadership meeting is also this negative attitude